Hello, everyone. This is Sam from Bigfoot Books here to give some commentary on No Man Knows My History, Chapter 1. If you only want to listen to the audiobook, go ahead and skip this and go to Chapter 2. If you're here to listen to me ramble on, well, here we go. Chapter 1, Fawn Brodie talks about how it's really important for us, if we want to understand Joseph Smith, we have to look at the environment from which he came. I think that's pretty fair to say about anyone. A lot of our behavior can become more readily understandable if we can perceive the context in which those behaviors were formulated. So Joseph is born in Vermont, and he's got lots of siblings. Basically, his dad is swindled by a con artist into basically throwing his entire life savings into the production and selling of this ginseng root, because there are these buyers in China supposedly that will give an arm and a leg to get a hold of this root. And so this is a long time ago, and it's a lot harder to enforce this kind of stuff, but people still get scammed today all the time. I live in Utah County, which is like the capital, the world's capital of pyramid schemes, MLMs, whatever you want to call it. There's a ton of people in my state of Utah right now that are totally being scammed. So it's important to not think of Joseph Smith Sr. as like some bumbling idiot or anything. He just somebody was with enough charisma and personality was able to convince him that the ginseng thing was a good idea, and it totally wasn't. And that sucks. And that's a really good example of the ways that like some things are out of our control, that can really mess up our lives. It really sucks that there's a lawnmower going in the background. But again, this is a totally free project. I'm not earning any money by doing this, and I don't plan to. You can Venmo me at Professor Plumb if you want to support what I'm doing, but I'm certainly not begging for it. But at any rate, yes, I do not have a soundproof studio, and I'm recording with the absolute most bare bones of technology at my disposal. So keep that in mind as we go through here. Hopefully there won't be too much distractions moving forward. So, the chapter 1 talks a little bit about the parents of Joseph Smith and kind of the environment they came from. It sounds like Lucy Mack Smith came from this kind of like real rugged, not cowboy, because that's anachronistic, but similar, frontier, kind of muddy, tawny, smoky environment that she grew up in, and that Joseph Sr. Grew up somewhat similarly. We've got this family would have just experienced the American Revolution, and that's crazy that they were at the center of a lot of the American history's most pivotal moments, the formulation of the United States Constitution, and things like that. And then Joseph Smith Jr., the prophet, would have been raised, he would have been a child, probably old enough to perceive the events of the War of 1812. I guess he would have been about 7 or 8 years old. At least by Mormon standards, that's the age of accountability. So I guess we can judge him by that standard. But at any rate, so this is a really pivotal part of American history, and it's really cool for me as someone who enjoys learning about American history that Joseph Smith wrote about his community being able to meet General Lafayette on his tour of America upon returning after the French Revolution. So I think that's really, really cool. So what lessons can we learn from this chapter? Like what is there to really talk about? One of the things that I think is important for us to understand Joseph Smith is on page 4, earlier in the chapter, it talks about how both Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack grew up in the era of a reaction to Calvinism. Calvinism is the doctrine, like one of the main tenets of Calvinism is like original sin plus like way more emphasis on how evil we are. Like not only did Adam and Eve like tarnish our world through their transgression in the Garden of Eden, but like more than that, like we are born in as like corrupt, evil. We are slaves to sin. We deserve to go to hell, and like only if God wants to save us do we like get lucky enough to be saved. Stuff like that. Like I'm not a theologian, so take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt, but like that's how I understand Calvinism. It's this very firm doctrine of like the depravity of the human soul and the necessity of prayer and repentance for salvation. And so it's interesting that it says that Joseph Smith's parents were raised in a religious environment that was a reaction to that, because I actually see a ton of that rhetoric in Mormonism. Now, Mormons don't believe in original sin. That's one of the articles of faith. But Mormons definitely are gluttons for self-punishment. If you read something like The Miracle of Forgiveness by Spencer W. Kimball, the Mormon prophet in the 1970s, I mean, that is chock full of doctrine about basically how evil we are and how everything we do that is against the will of God is like totally deserving to send us to outer darkness, were it not for the atonement. And I think apologists for Spencer W. Kimball will try to say that though his language was harsh, the centrality of his experience was talking about the beautiful redeeming power of the atonement of Jesus Christ. I have been given 2 copies of The Miracle of Forgiveness by 2 different bishops. So I know for a fact, I was born in 1995, so I grew up in the Mormon church in the early 2000s and 2010s. And so this is that type of rhetoric that everything we do against the will of God is irreparably severing us from goodness and worthiness until we repent, is absolutely still alive and strong. And that's just my anecdotal experience, and you can let me know in a comment or email me or whatever if yours was different, but that was my experience. And so I think that's important to reference, because this idea is prevalent in these sermons that are being taught by these traveling nomadic preachers that are going about. It talked about in the chapter about how these, even like the most finely dressed, most elegantly dressed, wealthy people were just like rolling around in the mud, like screaming and begging for salvation. So you see that a lot. You can find it on YouTube in the modern age with televangelists like Kenneth Copeland, who infamously, depending on how you look at it, declared through his broadcast that he had rebuked COVID. And this was in like 2020, so it was like early before it happened. As of this recording in September 2021, COVID is absolutely still killing people. And the Delta variant, if I understand it correctly, is about to like do horrible things in comparison to the already terrible COVID numbers. So you see televangelists like Kenneth Copeland and other people, particularly from the deep South United States, in this tradition of the people begging to be saved, reaching their arms out towards the preacher, speaking in tongues. These Pentecostal holy roller type traditions are still alive and well, which to me is astounding. And it also talked about in this chapter how there were people that were making bold claims about the millennium, that the second coming of Jesus Christ was imminent, or that it was already taking place. And so if you believe in God, you believe in the Christian Bible, and Joseph Smith's family would have read the King James Bible, which we know all too well, because there are errors from the King James Bible edition that Joseph Smith's family had that crept its way into the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which is seen by some as a smoking gun, that the Book of Mormon was absolutely written by Joseph Smith and not by the hand of divine revelation, or at least that this Bible was being used in the translation process. Translation being a very loosely, I'm using that word very generously, because we, at least from my point of view, the Book of Mormon translation, quote unquote, process was, it's not very translatory, so to speak. I think another thing interesting to point out about chapter 1 is this idea that the Mack family, Lucy Mack, Joseph's mother, had this unbroken tradition going from Joseph's grandfather onto his great-grandson. So 5 generations of storytellers, that these people not necessarily were Harvard educated or super poignant, eloquent speakers or anything, but they really prided themselves on writing down their own stories, which I think is really cool. I like telling stories. I do a lot of my storytelling through music, and that's one of the things that's drawn me towards performing, is that I get to tell stories, but I haven't spent a whole lot of time telling people about my story. And I don't have children, and it's not clear to me if I will have human children at some point. I enjoy my pets, but they can't really understand the stories that we tell. But if you're listening to this and you do have children, it may be worth thinking about the kinds of stories you tell. Maybe it's the books that you get from the library to read from your children. As we know, statistics have proven that pretty much nothing is more valuable to an infant, toddler, young child, pre-kindergarten than to just like read books to them all the day. So like as many books as possible. Like literacy is so important. So whether it's stories from the library or your personal books, or turning on PBS and having them watch Cocomelon or whatever, or like any of these things, you might think about the kinds of stories you are telling to your family, and whether those stories you feel represent the kind of values that you hold, and what you hope those values to develop into in the future. Because I think a lot of our lives are stories. We try to encapsulate people's stories as like facts, like because I experienced this must be true. But I feel like the actual truth is that much of our life is governed by narrative and like our own personal take. One of the phrases that has come to mind recently is this idea that atheists say all the time, and I've said this as well. It's like, how could anyone in their right mind believe this or come to this conclusion? Well, that's very bold of you to assume that you're in your right mind. You could look into a mirror and have some self-awareness. There are so many aspects of our personal beliefs and our ideas about the way the world works that are totally not true by any objective standard. And so I think we have to have some humility to look at our lives and kind of laugh a little bit and just say, yeah, maybe I'm not the expert I think I am. This is especially true for people who go and get all these academic letters next to their name. Oh, I have a PhD or I have a master's degree. Well, who cares? Especially depending on your field, in 20 years, that degree is meaningless unless you did continuing education, because we're finding out new ways about the world. I think that's one of the gigantic problems with the Mormon church right now, is that the quorum of the 12 apostles in the first presidency, the average age is like 82. These guys are so old, and almost every single, as far as I know, every single member of the quorum of the 15 top leadership of the Mormon church grew up without the internet. It's going to take another 20, 30 years to get the top leadership of the Mormon church to even be in the 21st century modality of like human society. This is insane. This is absurd. And we know that President Nelson is telling people to take social media fasts, not because it's good for them, and it is. I just deleted my TikTok account. I think I'm going to be a lot healthier for it. But like, it's not, it's because they don't want their members to discover the truth about the Mormon church. So, from my understanding, I don't have proof of this, but my understanding is that in recent memory, the last 5 years, anytime the prophet has asked for like a social media fast, it has been in direct correlation with like a burst of negative criticism towards the church. So it's like a little bit too convenient from my perspective. I don't have any examples of that, so that could be totally unfounded, but it's my understanding that the church likes to pull the trigger on these social media fasts whenever something bad is about to happen or has happened and they're trying to save face. And at any rate, take that for what you will. So, yeah, this chapter I think is all about setting the stage for us to learn more about Joseph Smith, this incredibly intelligent and creative and clever young man who grew up in an intensely competitive environment, competing for resources. Their family is abject; they're in abject poverty, and he's growing up in an environment where he's seeing these shakers, he's seeing them writhing on the floor and speaking in tongues, he's seeing these preachers come in. And I love that quote from Lucy Mack Smith. She seems so intelligent, where she says like the same thing that Joseph said in Joseph Smith history, where she's like, if I don't go to church, they'll say I'm like a sinner, but if I go to their church, then other people will say I'm going to the wrong one. And she says in her own words, no church will admit that I am right except the one with which I am associated. And so obviously Joseph Smith would have, that is almost the same quote, right, from Joseph Smith, where he's like, that is in the 1838 version of Joseph Smith history, the one that's published in the Pearl of Great Price and with which most chapel Mormons are familiar. That's why he went into the Sacred Grove, is because like, hey, none of these churches make sense. I think Methodism kind of like works. I get a lot of that, and the more you learn about the writing process of the Book of Mormon, it's very clear that Methodism has a pretty strong connection to Mormon doctrine, because there are some things, for example, like King Benjamin's discourse in the Book of Mosiah, that are just absolute talking points of like the Methodist preacher. So it's very clear that Joseph Smith really aligned himself with that church, which is so funny because one of the things that God said to Joseph, if we're to believe the 1838 account, is all these churches are an abomination. Not like they're kind of right, but we need you to like steer us on course. They said they are just like flat out just wrong, like completely wrong, which is so funny because the Mormon church today has completely thrown away that interpretation. They do not focus on that at all. One of the things that I appreciate, if there's anything to appreciate about 20th century Mormonism, is that they had the cojones to like say that out loud, like at General Conference and other places, like Bruce McConkie and people like that. They're horrible people, but I can appreciate like their nonchalance at saying like, no, the Catholic Church, 1 Nephi 13, that is the church of the devil. Like, what else would Joseph Smith have been talking about, or Nephi, whatever? Like, and so that's one of the things that doesn't make sense to me about modern day Mormonism, is this impulse to do this more charitable, well, we are the one true church and the only church that has the authority, but everyone else is great. That is the environment that I entered on my mission, is like, we were sent to give you the one true church, but also we don't want to offend anyone and cause bad reputation for the church. So we're just going to listen to you tell us about your worldview and pretend that it's beautiful and good, while secretly, as soon as we leave the lesson and get back into our car, we go, oh man, we got to get them baptized as soon as possible so that they can have the truth. I just think that's really silly. So it's interesting, very, very interesting that there's a huge amount of parallels that can be drawn between Lucy Mack Smith and her son Joseph, both growing up in an environment without a strict religious orthodoxy, and both finding things about the Methodist sect that seems to resonate with them. Okay, is there anything else to say? So yeah, I think it's important, going back to the ginseng, that Joseph Smith Sr. is not like some bumbling fool. He just had some bad luck, kind of trusted the wrong person, and that kind of sucks. But I don't think that it should be used as any sort of evidence to say that he was an idiot, or that Joseph Smith, by comparison, inherited his dad's poor intelligence. You can say whatever you want about Joseph Smith, the prophet, but he was not stupid. He was not stupid. And a lot of people go so far into that it defies history, saying that he was this uneducated kind of like hick farm boy. So how could he have written the Book of Mormon? The most common response to that from people that know the history better than I do, at any rate, is how could it have been written by anyone else? Like, that's the thing you need to know about Joseph Smith, is not how could he have written this. It has to be from God. It's, if you look at the history of Mormon origins and like the doctrines and the Book of Mormon translation process, it becomes abundantly clear that Joseph Smith, his fingerprints are all over that book. It is unexcusably, that's the wrong word. It is like so abundantly clear that Joseph Smith like wrote the Book of Mormon rather than the translation theories that are proposed by modern Mormon apologists. In my opinion, that's just I'm just taking that as a fact and presenting it as a fact. You are welcome to address those sources yourself and come to your own conclusion, but I think the jury is out on that, or the jury is not out. The jury is in. They are done. And as far as I know, Mormonism was completely a product of the environment of Joseph Smith. And this chapter seeks to establish that background. So this may be a good chapter to come back on the more we learn. This is a long book, and a lot of the themes of Joseph Smith's life and his ministry are going to be captured in these first few chapters. So I think that's all I'll say for this one. I hope you enjoyed my commentary on chapter 1 of Fawn Brodie's No Man Knows My History. Please feel free to reach out to me here, or you can email me at professorplum@protonmail.com if you want to chat or give me your feedback. Yeah, it's a real privilege for me to do this. I think it's really fun. I hope that my amateur reading, the mistakes that I make throughout, do not distract you from the overall quality of Fawn Brodie's amazing research. This book was from 1945, and the edition I'm reading, I think, is from like 1971. It's the second edition with some new factoids and some new resources and things. But this book deserves to be heard. And as far as I know, this audiobook, this is the only audio recording that I'm doing. I can't find one other one anywhere else, and I guess that's why I kind of took it upon myself to do it. I think I have a pretty engaging voice. I hope that my voice is clear and that I enunciate appropriately so that you don't feel like I'm mumbling, but I would appreciate any feedback that suggests that I am hard to comprehend or anything like that, so that I can adjust my pace or my consonant pronunciation or things like that. So hope you have a great rest of your day or week or wherever you find yourself in life, and know that hopefully your life will be better preserved than Joseph Smith, and your story and motives will be more readily available and not so shrouded in mystery, etc. Ciao.